I don't know why it's so hard. I mean, how hard can it be? You've got over 55 years of how a franchise works, what gave it its great appeal, why it became legendary, why it went from one generation to the next.
It's been a long road.
And yet, since 2009, there has been a fundamental effort by everybody involved to turn Star Trek into something that it isn't. And people would say, but Rob, Star Trek could be anything, could it not? Perhaps that's true. Maybe it could be anything. Maybe I'm off base. But the problem is, nothing that they've really done since Star Trek '09 has worked. It hasn't ignited the franchise. It hasn't cemented any of the new characters into pop culture consciousness. Modern Star Trek hasn't leapt beyond anybody who's, seen it. So has it worked? Has it sparked merchandising? They keep trying to reinvent Star Trek and make it relevant to the modern day, which is strange because you'd think that it would be a no-brainer because you have so much Star Trek to look at and go, well, that's how you do it. That's how you do it right. And yet, they can't. Why? Well, I don't think they fundamentally understand it because they're trying to turn Star Trek into something other than Star Trek. Viacom reportedly sees Star Trek Prodigy as a gateway to toys and theme park attractions, meaning for kids, because Star Trek Prodigy is on Nickelodeon and it is directed squarely at children, which is interesting because when I was a child, Star Trek appealed to me even before there was an animated Star Trek series. Now let's remember the CG animated series Prodigy is not about any human beings at all. It's about basically a gaggle of Guardians of the Galaxy-esque aliens. What's interesting about that premise to me, and again, I know people have worked on it, Star Trek then is no longer about human beings at all.
We don't know what to do about humans.
And is that Star Trek? I mean, sure, you could always do a show of all aliens set in the Star Trek universe, but then is it Star Trek? Fundamentally, what Prodigy is doing is once again taking the Star Trek premise and they're thinking about their universe. Now, my Burnett axiom, which is never put your universe before your characters in your story. Characters on Star Trek Prodigy, the design of them is supposed to appeal to kids on a kid level. I'd say that one of the things that appealed to me about Star Trek when I was a kid is that it wasn't trying to appeal to me on a kid level. It was a show that was about adults that appealed to me as a child. It wasn't a show that was appealing to me because I was a child. And I think there's a difference there. But they're now making a Star Trek show that is specifically directed towards children because, like everything else, they're thinking, okay, why can't we turn Star Trek into another franchise like Mission Impossible or Transformers or G.I. Joe that they have at Paramount? Why can't we turn it into Star Wars? Everybody wants their franchise to be like Star Wars or like Marvel. No! But the thing is, Star Trek as a franchise already existed. Arguably, the height of Star Trek popularity was in 1994. Next Generation, not its best season, its final season, but when it went off the air, it was huge. It had huge ratings. Within months, they had a feature film, Star Trek Generations, in theaters. Star Trek was on the cover of Time magazine. Deep Space Nine was into its second season. Star Trek was very, very popular. It was popular with 4 quadrants. Parents were watching with their kids. What they keep trying to do is turn the Star Trek franchise into the same kind of populist franchise that other franchises like Marvel or Star Wars are. You motherfuckers! But the thing is, by its very DNA, it's not that. Star Trek is not necessarily a 4-quadrant franchise. It appeals to people of all 4 quadrants. Star Trek is niche. It always was, and it will always be. And if it's not, it won't be Star Trek anymore. And they keep trying to make it something other than it is. And in my mind, they keep failing.
You can't keep getting away with it!
Mike McMahon and Lower Decks, you can't not watch Lower Decks as a Star Trek fan and smile. But again, it's still, even though Mike McMahon loves Star Trek, like so many writers of comedy, they're not inside. They love it, but they're always outside of it. They're always looking at it from that humorous perspective. Let's make fun of it all. We love it, but we're above it. And that's what I feel about Lower Decks is, yeah, it's got all the Star Trek tropes and it's got all its fun and zip-zap. Fandom loves its humor. So I get it. A lot of people love Lower Decks. It's a lot of fun, I suppose. But to me, it's outside of the franchise. It's not inside the franchise. It's outside. It's always with a wink and a nudge. But Lower Decks and Prodigy are inoffensive. I don't mind Lower Decks, and Prodigy has had some interesting stuff. Viacom CBS sees Prodigy as critical. Why they see it as critical, I don't know. See, the thing is, Star Trek did engage families. It's just, it didn't engage all families because Star Trek was a show that prized highbrow thinking as opposed to lowbrow thinking. And it was a show that was aspirational and it required thought on the part of the audience. That's what the Star Trek franchise is. It's a celebration of intelligence. Now, I'm not saying Star Trek Prodigy is dumb, but certainly J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movies were dumbed down.
Around the third or fourth script that we were shooting, there was a scene where I was supposed to sneak up behind somebody, a villain in this case, and pull my phaser and hit him. My phaser was my gun, right? You got that? Hit him on the head with the butt of it to render him unconscious. That's the way it was written in the script. When we approached the scene, I said to the director, this is archaic. This is really Western, you know, to pull a gun and hit a guy on the head from behind. He said, what do you want to do? And I said, this man's an alien. We don't know anything about aliens. We can say anything we want. We can make the audience believe anything we want about an alien. You know, let's use our imaginations. A man could have very special knowledge of the human anatomy that hasn't even been discovered yet, or he may have some special power that only Vulcans have, you see. Mm-hmm. I said, why don't I just apply pressure to a certain area of his neck and shoulder here and pinch a little bit, and he goes unconscious, you see. And I avoided what I consider physical violence, cracking people on the head. You know, it was a merciful way of knocking out an enemy.
I was not really a fan. My producing partner never saw it.
They were designed to appeal to a mass audience, i.e., a less intelligent audience than people who might have normally watched Star Trek. And from a financial standpoint, everyone doesn't understand this. They did not make money. None of the movies made money. They had barely doubled their production costs, if they did. Star Trek 09, people liked it because what it gave them was a pop culture memory version of Star Trek. Not real Star Trek, but sort of what your friends think Star Trek is supposed to be. That's what you got. It wasn't real Star Trek. It was a Star Trek simulation. Every time that J.J. Abrams did a TV interview or an online interview in 2009 when Star Trek came out, he was very quick to point out, I never liked Star Trek.
When I was a kid, I never liked Star Trek when I was a kid.
You are a douchebag.
They hired a man to direct and to revive their franchise. They spent $175 million on paper to make Star Trek 09, and it was being directed by a guy who in every interview would say, I never liked Star Trek.
Growing up, I always thought it was, honestly, I couldn't get into it. My friends loved it. And I would try, and I'd watch episodes, but it always felt too philosophical for me.
That's right, a douchebag.
The problem is, none of our big franchises are controlled anymore by people that love those franchises. As a matter of fact, they'd rather have people that don't love those franchises because that way they can do something new.
And this movie that we did, the goal was to make a movie for moviegoers, not just for Star Trek fans.
A total douchebag.
And this is the problem with the people that make Star Trek now. As Alex Kurtzman has said many times, I want to use the franchise for messaging of today. I guarantee you, no one is going to be 1,000 years in the future when you are a spacefaring civilization and you've met hundreds of alien species. No one in the future is going to be worried about being non-binary and ask you to call them by their pronouns.
See, in our century, we've learned not to fear words.
But they do in the 32nd century on Discovery. This is a monumental failure of creativity. What I don't understand is, they're not trying to make, say, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul appeal to children. They are what they are.
You're goddamn right.
So why Star Trek? Why is this thinking that it needs to appeal to children? I mean, sure, the platitudes that everyone rolls out, the idea of diversity and inclusion, not just as virtue signaling, but I mean, that's what Star Trek is. It's all about being the best you can be. It's the same way that, I'm sorry, but while Phantom Menace was successful, nobody wanted to see a 9-year-old Anakin Skywalker. That was a problem, because what they were trying to do is appeal to children. George Lucas didn't understand.
Jar Jar is a key to all this.
And by the way, he still doesn't understand. He still thinks that Star Wars appealed to children. No, Star Wars appealed to the child in everyone. And that's why we, young or old, loved Star Wars. Star Trek was kind of the same way, but it had the added element of intelligence. Not that Star Wars isn't intelligent, but Star Wars is simple. It's simple-minded. It's simple in its construction. It's fairy tale-like. Nothing wrong with that. Star Trek demanded a little bit more intellectual prowess to get around its ideas and concepts. That's what it's always been. But since 2009, everyone's like, we're in space. Star Wars is in space. What can we do to make our IP like Star Wars? The answer is you cannot.
What you're doing here is unethical. It's immoral.
You cannot make your IP like Star Wars. I understand you want that money. I get it. You think that, oh, we've got a space IP so it can be just like Star Wars. It cannot, without changing it and losing the essence of what made Star Trek successful in the first place. What's really interesting is this thinking, why don't we make Star Trek appeal to children? Well, why did you make a show like Star Trek Picard? Vicious, mean-spirited, dystopian, where you murdered people en masse in every episode. You had violence and gore such as we had never seen in Star Trek before. Why was that allowed? Where were these executives going, we need to make this appeal to children? Star Trek always appealed to like-minded kids. That's why it has longevity. What's so interesting, apparently this appeal to families is seen as important for Star Trek, which makes sense as new and younger fans can help to ensure longevity. Star Trek is still here. It's been here since 1966.
It's been a long road.
How much more longevity do you want? The thing that's threatening Star Trek's longevity is bad Star Trek. Clearly, they're not happy with where the Star Trek franchise is. And I would put that squarely on what we've been given as modern Star Trek. And they don't ever seem to do that. They don't ever seem to say, maybe the approach that we've been taking to Star Trek over the last 12 years, maybe that's the problem. But nope. Why do they keep getting to make Star Trek? I don't understand. I really don't. I do not get it. They're all rehashes. Even Star Trek Discovery, which started out as taking place in supposedly the canonical Star Trek universe, but we go back in time. Once again, a new version of Spock. Let's bring back Captain Pike and Number One from the cage. Let's do a Picard series where we're going to take Captain Picard, make him an older man, and make him appear and act nothing like the character of Jean-Luc Picard in order to serve as something to do what?
I do not know.
Star Trek Discovery, let's every season, let's change the premise, bring new things in, try and make it work. We wind up with a vat of gobbledygook of things that make no sense, nothing that seems to work, and pseudoscience and fantasy that would be rejected by even the worst pulp fiction writer.
I have had enough of you!
And it's strange to me that we are watching over the last 12 years a franchise being run into the ground. New showrunners every season. The same people that stick around are the ones that are also responsible for really horrifically bad science fiction and terrible television storytelling. There's no real science going on. Nothing makes sense.
Everything about this seems wrong.
Even the vision or the thought behind the galaxy itself. How big is it? Well, the people certainly who are writing Star Trek have no understanding of any of that.
I don't know.
Which is currently on display in every episode of the show. They're just trying things that may or may not work. And the problem is, when you listen to any of the Star Trek showrunners talk, they just spout talking points.
I don't know.
I never feel like I'm getting something really from them personally. When Akiva Goldsman says he went to his first convention, he never waxed rhapsodic about a certain episode. Like, what was your favorite episode of Star Trek, Akiva Goldsman? And could you give me a half an hour, do a half an hour riff on it? I never feel that anybody that is working on modern Star Trek has anything to say of any kind of weight or give me any sense that they understand what they're doing. I mean, hey, it's a good, cushy job, yes. But I just feel that everyone there is fake phony. You get the gig. Michelle Paradise, not someone who I see as some great Star Trek fan.
I can't answer some of these questions.
Of course, you're going to say you're a Star Trek fan. You know, and you look over at Star Wars and you got people like Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau who are clearly Star Wars fans. Everything on Star Trek, the ship designs, the art direction, it feels like there's nobody who's running the show that you go, wow, why are these decisions being made? Like, who thought this stuff up? Every time I read anything about Star Trek today, all of it is to try and turn Star Trek into something that it isn't. Let's make it appeal to kids. Star Trek isn't supposed to be for children. It's supposed to appeal to children, but it's supposed to appeal to everyone. That's why real Star Trek fans started out as children and grew up with it. That's why Star Trek was successful for 40 years, because it put its hooks in you early on and you grew up with it.
It's been a long road.
Modern Star Trek ran for 18 years. TNG to the end of Enterprise, 18 years, 25 seasons of TV. That's a long run. What I don't understand is, why isn't somebody looking at that? You know, why isn't somebody going to the Berman run of Star Trek and go, wow, this was successful on TV? And sure, there was the law of diminishing returns. There was things that were changing.
It's been a long road.
But it's still, they gave us a quality program for 18 years. Star Trek Discovery has changed its premise every year. They can't even go 2 years without changing what they're doing. Yep, after 2 years, we're going to throw in the towel and go into the future. We want to get rid of Star Trek continuity. What do? Give us the Guardian of Forever. One of the reasons that I love Star Trek Picard Season 3 so much is I hated Picard Seasons 1 and 2. And one of the problems that people run into with these franchises is that in order to make them work, you have to go back and get the actors that everyone loved in those roles. Now, Patrick Stewart, indelible performance as Jean-Luc Picard.
There are 4 lights.
Acting.
I think that without him, Star Trek wouldn't have moved beyond 13 episodes of The Next Generation. Bringing actors back and the studios, the executives, the actors are tired of playing these characters.
Did you shoot Greedo first, or did Greedo shoot you first?
I don't care.
And they want to put more of themselves. They want to inject more of their own life experience into these characters. And this happens not just with Star Trek characters, but anybody who comes back wants to put more of themselves into the role. Or in the case of Harrison Ford, they want you to kill that character so he doesn't have to deal with it anymore.
I don't care.
But what ends up happening is that in order to attract the talent to come back, you have to appease their ideas. We saw a lot of that in the Star Trek movies. Patrick Stewart wanted to be seen as more of a romantic, action-oriented lead. And I understand that. I mean, look at how he looks in First Contact. He's buff. Look at what he gets to do in Nemesis. He gets to go off-roading. He gets to be the romantic lead in Insurrection and have a romance. And hey, I don't blame him. So in coming back and enticing him to do Star Trek Picard as a series, it was really Star Trek Patrick Stewart.
You're not the same person that you were 25 years ago. Neither is Jean-Luc Picard.
One of the things I understood when I worked on these projects is the actors, and this is not a slam, but the actors that play these roles, they are not the characters they are portraying. They're actors portraying a character that is written for them. And another thing they don't know is the lore. One of the things that surprised me when we did the Blu-rays for Next Generation is I sat down with Brent Spiner. I sat down with all the cast and interviewed them for hours on end. We had a long time with them, and you can see those interviews on the Blu-rays. But Brent Spiner told me, and I believed him. He said, I've never seen a full episode of Next Generation. The only things I've seen are the movies. And I was like, really? And he said, look, I made the episodes. I know what they were. Why would I go back and watch them? Now, Michael Dorn was the opposite. Michael Dorn, classic film fan. Michael Dorn watched the episodes. He knew the episodes. He also had an encyclopedic knowledge of classic movies. And by the way, he kicks fucking ass in Picard Season 3.
I have slaughtered countless enemies over the years and considered sending their heads to all of you.
I'm not going to diss on Patrick Stewart. But when I interviewed Patrick Stewart for those Blu-rays, one of the first things I said to him was, I'm not going to ask you about Star Trek. And he laughed and he said, what do you mean? I said, well, if I were to ask you about the Battle of Narendra 3 and the geopolitical situation between the Romulans and the Klingons at that time and what the loss of the Enterprise C meant to that, what was going on at the time, what would you tell me? And he just laughed. He goes, I don't even know what you're talking about. And I'm like, exactly.
I've seen everything. I've seen it all.
And that guy, because of his power as an actor, was put in a position where he's designing stories for a show that obviously he was in, but he was outside of it. So in Picard, especially season 2, you will notice there is a lot of Patrick Stewart's own backstory coming from an abusive home. A lot of the storyline that they incorporated into Picard season 2 was based on Patrick Stewart's own life. And I don't begrudge an actor for wanting to do that. I think that's something people should do. It makes it more resonant to them. So the thing is, not maybe so much for Star Trek. And I think one of the reasons that I hated Star Trek Picard seasons 1 and 2 is I thought it was not very well written science fiction and not very well written Star Trek. The actors tried as hard as they could. Creators Michael Chabon, who I really adore his writing, but maybe working in science fiction television wasn't his strong suit. And you can tell from both season 1 and season 2 of Picard that no one really had a handle on what they were making. Now, I didn't know showrunner Terry Matalas, who became the sole showrunner of Star Trek Picard Season 3. No one else really wanted to do it. Akiva Goldsman wanted to go on and do Strange New Worlds. Alex Kurtzman went and did his sequel to Nicholas Roeg's Man Who Fell to Earth. So anyway, Terry Matalas, a man I didn't know, was given basically the key to the kingdom to showrun Star Trek Picard Season 3. And he could do whatever he wanted. Now, the thing about Terry Matalas is he started working in the entertainment business in Deep Space Nine in the post-production. He was an intern for post-production on Deep Space Nine. He worked for Brandon Braga on both Voyager and Enterprise, and then went on and worked with Brandon on shows like Threshold and worked his way up as a writer-producer, and now he's a writer-producer-director on Star Trek Picard Season 3. Now, when you watch Star Trek Picard Season 3, it's like watching a different show. It feels different from the very beginning. Structurally, it feels different. Everything feels different. The music feels different. Everything. But what was apparent to me is that it just felt like Star Trek. And because it's the Next Generation cast, and I had gone through making all the documentaries with them and even hosted a roundtable conversation up in Calgary celebrating the 25th anniversary, I knew all the Next Generation cast. And one of the things that surprised me about Star Trek Picard Season 3 is how good they all are. The writing for Star Trek Picard Season 3 is just really good from a character standpoint. There are recurring character themes throughout the whole series. I loved it. I've watched all 10 hours 3 times. I loved it for no other reason than I thought it was very good Star Trek. It has an epic, sprawling, fun, action-adventure romp of a plot. It has high drama. It has emotional stakes. It has everything you want. It's a Next Generation movie told over 10 hours. It feels like the best Next Generation movie we just never got. And I love it. I love the characters. I love the new characters. Ed Spaliers and Todd Stashwick play new characters that we haven't met before. There's old friends, there's old acquaintances, and there's new characters. I'll tell you something. You have more affection for the bridge crew of the Titan A than you ever did for any of the bridge crew on Discovery. Not because the actors aren't good at what they do, but the characters are just not defined. And it felt like Star Trek. Now, are angels going to come down from the heavens when you watch this? No. It's Star Trek. But here's the best thing for me. When you watch the series, the closest thing that I can say that Star Trek Picard Season 3 is like watching the Star Trek version of Top Gun Maverick, if that makes any sense at all.
The situation is analogous.
Star Trek Picard Season 3 is the Top Gun Maverick of Star Trek. That's what it is. But instead of one person, instead of Maverick coming back, it's a bunch of people. And yes, you have to deal with certain canonical issues that have come about because of Star Trek Picard 1 and 2. You have to remember that the Rikers both lost a son. That's something that you should remember. If you don't, it's perfectly explained. But I just liked Star Trek Picard Season 3 because it felt like I was watching a Next Generation movie about these characters coming back 30 years later. And I was smiling the whole time. Smiling. I'll admit, I shed tears. I defy any Next Generation fan not to cry. Star Trek Strange New Worlds is New Coke. It's the Vegas show version of Star Trek. Tonight at the Wynn, see the greatest show on the strip, Star Trek Strange New Worlds. See the romance, see the colors, see Captain Pike cook for everybody. Because he does. I really do like the cast of Strange New Worlds. Beginning with Anson Mount, I think the cast is uniformly excellent. I think that where all of modern Star Trek has fallen down is in the really substandard, infantilized teenage writing that we get.
How close do you want to get? First date or third date?
I get used to having a woman on the bridge.
Star Trek Strange New Worlds should be one of the most sophisticated science fiction shows that has ever been on television. And I feel like it's YA Star Trek. It feels entirely infantilized. But the thing that I really hate the most about Strange New Worlds is the infantilization of Spock. They've basically turned Spock into a teenager/college student, where almost everyone is smarter than he is. Dr. Mbenga gives Spock his Vulcan harp. and tells him to start playing it. Why is it that at any instance they have to have Spock, oh, here's the first time you've ever done this? Why is it like here's what I do not understand. In this season, you see Pike teaching Spock to cook. Why? It drives me crazy. The gentlemen that wrote this episode are Henry Alonso Myers and Akiva Goldsman. They really run Star Trek Strange New Worlds. It's their show. So when you see this first episode, you're getting their opinion of what Star Trek is supposed to be in its purest form. And in its purest form is to just steal random plot points from Star Trek's history. The idea of having a character based on Khan Noonien Singh, it's Akiva Goldsman doing what Akiva Goldsman does, which is make wrong choices and, frankly, dumb decisions all the time. One of my favorite books is Mark Halperin's book, A Winter's Tale. Akiva Goldsman wrote and directed that film. I can't remember a worse adaptation of a novel. I walked out of the theater seething. Not many people went to the theater, but I walked out seething with anger. And most of Akiva Goldsman's successes have been adapting other people's work because it's Akiva Goldsman. And if he's not adapting somebody else, his original ideas, not so good.
We try always to have the characters show up not the way we last saw them.
Your intellect is as weak as your dollar. Failure is your destiny. You disrespect yourself. You are made of stupid.
It makes me angry. It makes me angry because I, as a viewer, since I was 5 years old, always expected to see Star Trek punching above my weight class. It used to be smarter than me. Deep Space Nine was smarter than me. Nothing that happens in modern Star Trek ever surprises me. I'm always ahead of the plotting. I'm always like, they took this from this, and this from this, and this from this. I am not surprised by anything in Star Trek. And what's interesting is if you look at other shows like House of the Dragon, I even knew what was going to happen in House of the Dragon. But their portrayal of what's going on in Westeros, it keeps you on the edge of your seat because it's not talking down to you. Why isn't Star Trek on the cutting edge of science fiction? Why are we watching in every episode a regurgitated Star Trek idea from somewhere else? As a thought exercise, watch Amok Time and then watch Journey to Babel. Then watch episode 5 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Give me something that's not so dumbed down. Why is it that Strange New Worlds can only go into our history when it's explaining something? One of the great things I used to love about Star Trek was when it's like the Magna Carta or the Declaration of Independence, and then somebody would list like 5 other things that we didn't know what they were because they were made up sci-fi things from other planets. Strange New Worlds doesn't do that. Let's go back and make Stacey Abrams the president of the world. Let's talk about the January 6th insurrection. I hate it.
I am not a merry man.
Again, monumental failure of creativity. Another thing I can't stand on Star Trek Strange New Worlds, I have no problem with lots of female characters. But why is it that when people come to fix the Enterprise, to give it upgrades, why is it all the male people that are coming on the ship? Why are they all put in their place by the women, by Ortegas and by Uhura? Uhura's an ensign. Well, no, I fix these things myself. And these guys, you'd think, these are Starfleet engineers. Why is it that they're put down? There's a really weird undercurrent of male hatred in Star Trek. The first time Pike is introduced, he's introduced with one of his crew is one of the most annoying fuckheads I've ever seen in not just Star Trek, but in any television show. And he's introduced as part of Pike's crew. And he's set up from the beginning to be an annoying asshole so he can be killed in the episode. They kill him. And the reason they kill him is because he's annoying. I mean, it's amazing. The Star Trek short takes, the one with the tribbles, perhaps one of the most offensive science fiction 15 minutes or whatever that I've ever seen.
I guess the question is whether Mr. Barclay is Enterprise material.
And I assume by your request for his transfer that you think he's not, Commander.
I just don't think you're the right fit for the kind of work we're doing here, so I've requested to have you transferred.
It's easy to transfer a problem to someone else.
This conversation's over. You're dismissed.
Too easy.
This is the end of the conversation.
He's a member of your team.
I'm having you transferred. End of conversation.
Try to find some way to help him to make a positive contribution. Get to know the man better.
Captain, if I could.
You can't.
Right, but I have this as
The conversation's over. That's the end.
It's been a long road, getting from there to here.
Epic fail. Epic fail. It's a bummer. I don't like it, and it makes me angry.
I am not a merry man.
I wish it was better. There's going to be a lot of people, I love it. I understand, because everybody, look, I see myself in it. I'm reflected back, because everybody wants to see themselves and everything, because we live in a narcissistic, navel-gazing culture. I liked a Star Trek where I met people I didn't know, people I aspired to be, not people that I recognize myself in them. And I don't understand what that obsession with people today is. Well, I want to see myself. I need to feel that I'm identified in the shows that I watch. I never wanted to watch shows or movies where I'm in them. I wanted to meet people I didn't know, people from different cultures, people who felt differently than I did. Star Trek now is being written for infants. It's being written for dumb people. And I know that a lot of people like it. And I don't mean to criticize the audience. The audience certainly isn't dumb. The audience is looking for compelling, great science fiction. You can tell because all of the shows that everybody is watching, from Yellow Jackets to Yellowstone to Succession to Better Call Saul to White Lotus, take your pick. Whatever your favorite show is, it's a good bet. You imagination connoisseurs, you are smart, astute viewers. And you want great programming. And I know this because everybody I know is watching great television. And I just feel that this audience, we imagination connoisseurs and the audience at large, we're the same people loving Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon. We deserve House of the Dragon level science fiction to watch. And Star Trek should be there. I feel like I have to go back into the original Star Trek Writer's Guide from 1967. This is Gene Roddenberry's Writer's Guide. The Star Trek format is actually that simple. If you're a TV professional, you already know the following 7 rules. 1. Build your episode on an action-adventure framework. We must reach out, hold and entertain a mass audience of some 20 million people, or we simply don't stay on the air. 2. Tell your story about people, not about science and gadgetry. Joe Friday doesn't stop and explain the mechanics of his 38 before he uses it. Dr. Kildare never did a monologue about the theory of anesthetics. Matt Dillon never identifies and discusses the breed of his horse before he rides off on it. Keep in mind that science fiction is not a separate field of literature with rules of its own, but indeed it needs the same ingredients as any story, including a jeopardy of some kind to someone we learn to care about. A climactic build, sound motivation, you know the list. 4. Then with that firm foundation established, interweave it in any statement which can be made about man, society, and so on. Yes, we want you to have something to say, but say it entertainingly as you do on any other show. We don't need essays, however brilliant. 5. Remember always that Star Trek is never fantasy. Whatever happens, no matter how unusual or bizarre, must have some basis in either fact or theory and stay true to that premise.
It's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it, not as we know it.
Don't give the enemy starflight capability and then have them engage our vessel with grappling hooks and drawn swords. Unless, of course, it's Day of the Dove. 6. Don't try and tell a story about whole civilizations. We've never yet been able to get a usable story from a writer who began, I see the strange civilization which... 7. Stop worrying about not being a scientist. How many cowboys, police officers, and doctors wrote westerns, detective, or hospital shows? I think there's a lot of lessons to be had there. I don't understand how the powers that be are allowing Secret Hideout and Bad Robot to control this entire franchise when they have not delivered a quality product. Who does that? Who does that? Since 2009, Star Trek has continually underperformed. And yet, the same people that have made underperforming Star Trek, by any metric, merchandising, box office, ratings, by any metric, Star Trek has underperformed for 12 years. And yet, the same people control this franchise. What business allows that to happen? I don't get it.